Hello there.
The cinema courtroom is now in session.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, welcome back to the Cinema Courtroom Show, a podcast where your favorite blockbusters await trial with your host and galactic judge, Makram Mark, presiding. Do not forget to like and subscribe on whatever, and I mean whatever, streaming platform that you're listening to, whether it be Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or the Cinema Courtroom YouTube channel. Because listen, between you and I, let me let you on a secret. Every click on the icon counts. You know why? Because it alters the tide of the complex algorithm and makes my podcast more accessible to more viewers. Therefore, by ringing the notification bell and sharing this podcast with your friends, family, cat, dog, pigeon, whoever, you will be supporting the show in the simplest way. Now, without further ado, let us begin with our review topic, Army of the Dead.
We are putting together a crew for a job.
Yeah, what does it pay?
Well, if it pans out, you make $2 million for one day's work.
$2 million.
But
That's my share. That's just for me. $2 million if it pans out. 100% I'm in. Yeah.
You don't want to know, the risks or...
Why would I want to know the risks? $2 million? It's a lot of cash. Listen, I hate my life so deeply. If I had $2 million, my life would change drastically. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
you sure you don't want to know?
I bet it had something to do with a helicopter.
Yeah.
I'm the helicopter guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, here's the thing. I've viewed countless zombie apocalypse tropes being constantly overused in blockbuster pictures over the years, and I've grown indisposed of it. Like, make no mistake, I enjoy zombie thriller movies. Like, don't get me wrong, I genuinely do. They're pretty awesome. Even if I'm not mad obsessed with the genre like other audiences of the population might be. And you know what? I still really like zombie thrillers and apocalypse movies. But my main issue with the vast majority of them is that I've always wanted to see them incorporate an original concept once in a while. Like, I can confidently say that the Army of the Dead has somewhat of an original zombie apocalypse structure, but not entirely, in the sense that there isn't that obnoxious person who screws everyone over, and somehow they get to be the only survivor. Like, it's injustice. Like, it's not fair. Why does the person who indirectly... I don't know. Anyway, I'm getting off trail. I am going to get to who I'm referring to in just a moment in Army of the Dead. In this review, though, I want to explore these following elements before the Cinema Courtroom reaches a finalized verdict for Army of the Dead. The plot for Army of the Dead, acting and characters, especially with Dave Bautista as Scott Ward, how the movie is shot and filmed, in which I'll be using the Viva Las Vegas opening as a prime example, what makes Army of the Dead distinct from other zombie thriller genres, Zack Snyder's competency as a director, and if that directing is exhibited in the Army of the Dead movie. And of course, I'm going to conclude this review with an answer to the following verdict. Does the Cinema Courtroom recommend this picture? Alrighty, before we get to all that, let us begin with the plot of this movie. A man approaches Ward with a juicy proposal. There is $200 million stacked under a vault. Acquire the cash and succeed in an escape from a vault in Las Vegas before the government launches a nuke on the city. So anyway, we can tell right off the bat that Army of the Dead combines the heist and zombie genre, all convoluted into one single hybrid movie stew. I would like to talk about one fundamental aspect of the plot for Army of the Dead, though. It has less plot armor when it comes to the protagonists who are on the heist mission, or whatever. And pretty much all of the crew, except Kate, have died, rendering the mission almost pointless. But oh wait, at least Kate gets to keep all that money, am I right? The thing that annoyed me the most about this movie, and I've briefly mentioned it in the opening segment of this review, it happens in most zombie apocalypse movies, by the way. It's not just Army of the Dead, but nonetheless, it still annoyed me. Because I expected it to be, to divert from whatever. There is always that annoying character that screws up the mission and costs other people their lives. For a matter of fact, that's all I've ever got from the movie. A teenage girl, or she might be in her early or late 20s, I don't know, wanders off, and then as usual, Scott Ward has to run after her to save her because she's his daughter. I mean, look, I was just anticipating that there would be more to the heist element in this movie in terms of logistics. I wanted it to feel like an actual heist. It's meant to be a zombie thriller, but if it promised to give an audience both experiences, I don't see why we can't incorporate both in a way that's seamless. But I get it. At the end of the day, it is a zombie movie, and they focused more time on showcasing other zombies and their sheer level of intelligence. I'll admit, that's pretty cool. Very often in most zombie thriller movies, zombies are portrayed as empty-handed monsters devouring brains. That isn't really the case in Army of the Dead. By making the zombies a tad smarter than other zombie iterations in other movies, zombies are then made to be a formidable threat, and what that does is increase the stakes because the zombie can calculate your every move. It's like an actually human, knows how to fight you, and you need to stand your ground. It's not like pow pow pow, the zombie's gone. The zombies actually kill people, and it makes us fear for the protagonist's life. That in itself is what a plot for a movie in the zombie thriller genre, like Army of the Dead, should be. Now that I've talked about the plot for Army of the Dead, what about the acting and characters? For one, Dave Bautista has finally come out of his shell in terms of not just being a side character in a comic book movie series, but rather Dave Bautista has become his own man, his own character. And his acting for the most part of Army of the Dead is acceptable. But I'm not sure if it's acceptable enough for him to, be like, oh, maybe that his acting career is better than his wrestling career. It's not that, but it's good enough to enjoy, and there's nothing really to complain about. Especially because his performance is okay. Or, very exceptional. Whatever. It depends on the movie. I think when it comes to the MCU, it may be okay acting because he's not given a chance to shine. I mean, he did in the first Guardians of the Galaxy, but not always do we get to see him lead a movie and just have a chance to, prove his worth in the industry and just show him show us what he's made of. So anyway, it's not the acting that is lacking in Army of the Dead. What I think Army of the Dead lacks the most, and that's something I've noticed, and you might interpret it differently, of course, because after all, we have Kate and Dave Bautista's Scott Ward. The characters on screen just come off as one-dimensional. And I'm not talking about, the relationships. If anything, there's nothing more to them but the relationships that they have on screen and their dynamics. Let me share an example about what I mean when I say that characters are just being portrayed with one angle. Scott Ward is a chef who works for this restaurant, and he is a soldier veteran. Okay, great. We got at least one dimension of the character to better comprehend him. But what we don't understand really is why Scott Ward is passionate about kicking ass, going on heists, and fighting zombies. And I think that affects the quality of the movie in terms of character progression. Because how can a character go from point A to B if there isn't even an A to begin with? Another thing about the acting and characters for Army of the Dead, and that's something I would give this movie a fair amount of credit for, the portrayal of the on-screen relationship of Scott Ward and his daughter Kate, regardless of how Ward has to run after her to save her from her own reckless decision-making. I think that the portrayal of Ward and his daughter, Kate's relationship for the most part, was convincing, and something that I've noticed from their back and forth relationship dynamic. And that's mostly Hollywood's fault because they always lean into this kind of cliche writing. Like, Scott Ward and Kate talk about opening this shop before they happen to face imminent doom. You know, they're obviously not, only one of them are going to come out alive, you know? Let me try and illustrate what has become such a repetitive Hollywood cliche, and we definitely see it in Army of the Dead. When Jeremy Nichols, let's say, briefs another character before he goes off to fight in Vietnam. Hey, let's finish this treehouse once I get back from Vietnam. The audience immediately knows that Jeremy Christopher Brian Nichols is not coming back home from Vietnam. So it's essentially like that very cliche scenario when it comes to Ward's death at the end of the movie. I mean, it was predictable. We knew Scott Ward was probably going to die. That doesn't mean that I don't like it, but that's just something weirdly fascinating that I noticed about how the character's dialogue in Army of the Dead is structured, and just how, overall, and through the acting, this movie managed to effectively utilize the characters in order to elevate the stakes of a zombie thriller picture, where almost everyone is expected to be on the chopping board. And they do die in the third act, for a matter of fact. I expected death. You know, I expected characters to get killed off, but I expected at least 3 characters to split the money 3 ways and just move on with their godforsaken lives. But obviously that isn't the case. Kate was the only sole survivor. And apparently another person who I wouldn't say who we didn't know survived before. But we were meant to know that Kate, out of the group, was the only one that survived. Alright, so I've talked about how both the plot and characters raised the stakes of Army of the Dead. And I touched on a bit of Dave Bautista's acting, you know, and giving him his time to shine and all that. And also the movie's bad quality in terms of character progressions. But the next thing I want to talk about before I explore the difference between Army of the Dead and other thriller genres is how this movie is shot, and especially in the Viva Las Vegas opening. I like to call it Viva Las Vegas because they play the Viva Las Vegas song in that montage, and I absolutely dig it. Viva Las Vegas. Alright, enough of that. Not only do I dig the song in that intro, but I also dig how the entire thing is shot, and the way the credits, you know, complement the visuals. That's how you open a movie. Okay, when you're sitting down and turning on a movie, it's not meant to just be talking. It's also, when we're talking about a zombie thriller, it's meant to showcase all the action, give us a taste of what we're going to get in later on in the first act, the second act, and the third act. It's essentially like a trailer. Not really, because it's, you know, integral to the story, but it's like an inner marketing, you know, scheme that I believe works. When you open a movie with a bang, the audience knows what to expect. That same momentum. Pachoom, pachoom, pachoom. Like, you know, like the way this movie mixed explosions and gunshots with the drums in that opening song. Like, excuse my personification, but if the rhythm used Tinder to find a date, the sound effects of the explosions and gunshots of the Army of the Dead opening would be a perfect match. Okay, this might come off as a lame attempt at an unscripted joke, but hey, I tried. Alright, so just to recap what I covered in this review again. I talked about the plot, acting and characters, and I just briefly conversed about the Viva Las Vegas opening of the movie, but I want to talk about another thing that will be a substantial contributing factor to the finalized verdict of this picture. What makes Army of the Dead different from other zombie thriller genres? Well, I want to discuss two things. How this movie exhibits the hierarchy of zombies and the nuance being there, being multiple zombie types being explored in one movie as well. So a concept that Zack Snyder really wants to try and convey so that it can stick in the audience's consciousness is that there are two tribes in the zombie hierarchy, Alpha and Shambler. And based on my full comprehension of this movie, based on that what I know, we have the Alpha. If the Alpha bites the victim becomes the Alpha. And then something remarkable about the Alpha zombies is that they are fast, agile, they're clearly responsive to the higher-ups in command. And then we have the Shambler, and that's where the hierarchy thing comes into play. Because there's a catch. There is an Alpha called Zeus who bites the victim. And you know how those victims turn into Alphas? Well, if there's an Alpha other than Zeus that bites the victim, that's how they become a Shambler. Confusing, I know. I had to rewatch some parts of this movie again and listen to what Zack Snyder himself said. So, that's apparently how it was intended to be. And I think if that is really the case, then this movie is quite unique in exploring that. And I don't think many zombie thriller genres give that additional dimension to the zombies. It's just all about survival. And that's, I think, something Army of the Dead has in common with other zombie thrillers, of course. The protagonist is trying to survive. Don't get me wrong, the concept of Army of the Dead, as written on paper, is very clever. Genius, even. And, like right now, I'm on board with the nuance behind it. It's just that this movie is expecting the average moviegoer to go to France and automatically know how to speak French. You know what I mean? And the reality is, it doesn't work like that. Or maybe it kind of does, but it shouldn't. Because just like going to France, if the French people take pride in their tourism economy, just like Zack Snyder takes pride in his movies, they need to get people to understand and accept the complex premises of it that you might not necessarily understand, or may not be easy to understand. Because listen, a movie still has to assume that the audience is intelligent. Alright, we cannot just, dumbify the concept. Because if anything, the audience will actually feel patronized. Because like, you didn't have to tell us that. Why are you telling me this? Like stop. I don't want to. I want you to get to the actual plot, please. That's how I honestly feel when a movie does that. But the thing is, make it easier for them to at least make their own interpretation of the content and go, now that makes sense, because they have something that they can point to reference. Because it seems to me, and that Army of the Dead doesn't appear that different from other zombie thrillers that incorporate the genre when it comes to just throwing concepts out there. On the other hand, I think that, and if you get mad at me for saying this, let's just say I'll understand. But look, it mostly depends on the intelligence of the moviegoer when watching Army of the Dead. Because I'm betting 2 cents that maybe a half of you who are listening to this podcast didn't even know there was a zombie hierarchy. I literally noticed it in the movie, and I read Zack Snyder's interview. But that's something, people who just want to watch this movie once are not going to pick up the first time. So, what I'm really trying to say is that maybe Army of the Dead won't resonate well with people who don't understand it for what it's trying to be, and that is completely fair. However, I think being equipped with a broad comprehension of the film that you're watching can still go a long way. My point is, Army of the Dead's difference from other zombie thriller genres is very subjective and is mostly determined by the average moviegoer's intellect when sitting down to watch the movie. Sorry to be blunt, but I think that is the case with this movie. Alright, so I talked about Army of the Dead's plot, acting and character progressions, Viva Las Vegas opening, and what makes Army of the Dead different. I want to finish off this review with two more things. Zack Snyder's ability as a director and the Cinema Courtroom's full recommendation of Army of the Dead. Zack Snyder is a very, and I'm not just saying that, like, he is a very talented director. For one, Zack Snyder knows how to direct a comic book movie. He knows his shit about the genre. Like, Zack Snyder's Justice League is on my list of top DC movies because Zack Snyder did a brilliant job of it. Keep into consideration that Zack Snyder's Justice League movie was 4 hours, yet it felt like 1 hour to me. That's how good it was. That being said, if you look on IMDb, you'll see that it wasn't just Zack Snyder that penned the screenplay. Zack Snyder had other people working on the story as well. The performance of Zack Snyder's Justice League is an indication that it resonated successfully with the vast majority of the audience. And as such, because the audience is engaged with Zack Snyder's film, they end up being engaged by the writing of it, which can only be achieved by top-tier writers in the industry that can successfully conjure a first-rate screenplay. This leads to my next fundamental point. Zack Snyder needs a team of talented writers to keep him in check for Army of the Dead. And I don't know whether or not Zack Snyder even consulted with his writing team when working on Army of the Dead. Now, don't get me wrong, the good work of the movie, or most of the movie, should be credited to Zack Snyder. He is the literal brain and muscle behind the production. It falls apart without him. But even the most competent directors can fall short without a group of talented writers to keep him in check. Also, you think of it as a king without an advisor. A king just making decisions on a whim. Well, you know how the civilization's going to end up, right? It might not bode well for, in the movie's case, the general audience, because it might not be as caliber as they're expecting from Zack Snyder. I think what Zack Snyder is really skilled at, and that's why he's been doing well when it came to comic book movies, is that he knew how to pick the right team, and he knew, what amount of creative decisions that to delegate to those people. But it wasn't just Zack Snyder. No. This wasn't just Zack Snyder working on the movie. It was a multi-group process. I'm of the impression that Zack Snyder is slightly, not all of the way, mind you, but he slightly went off the rails when writing and directing Army of the Dead. However, I do think, given, all of these drawbacks, there is still an upside to what he did with Army of the Dead. He managed to effectively capture the zombie apocalypse tone impeccably and raise the stakes high, which is all the moviegoer should get to ask for. We're not asking him to be Steven Spielberg or Christopher Nolan or Quentin Tarantino. We just want him to direct a movie that leaves people on the edge of their seats. And I think Army of the Dead managed to do just that. With all of these points down in this review, Army of the Dead's zombie apocalypse plot combining the heist and zombie thriller genre, Dave Bautista coming out of his shell as an actor, characters portrayed as flat and one-dimensional at times, the exceptional and beautiful Viva Las Vegas opening, reflecting how well the movie is shot overall. Army of the Dead's difference from other zombie thriller movies being subjective, and how it's imperative for the director of the movie to have more of a writing team other than him. The Cinema Courtroom recommends Army of the Dead for any moviegoer that is holding out for a multi-hour, brainless, yet entertaining escape. Court is adjourned. You may be seated. And now we begin to approach the second half of the Cinema Courtroom show, which is the post-sentencing hearing. What is the post-sentencing hearing, you may ask? Well, I'm glad you inquired about this, because you see, in the first half of the Cinema Courtroom podcast, we reviewed Army of the Dead, which is among many films that I have selected, which could be Old and New, Big and Small, Underrated and Overrated, The Broken and the Damned, Black, White, Brown, Orange, and Blue. Then, in the second half of this podcast, I assemble all of the leftover topics that pertain to the film industry in general, movie news and movie-relevant subject matters that aren't just limited to one specific movie, and integrated into one post-sentencing hearing list. Think of it as an after-party that is long overdue, perhaps, where you are invited, or in judiciary terms, an invitation to a retrial in order to rectify an unjust hearing. Because sometimes, or all of the time really, like the organic sapien that I am, I find that I've been too critically generous or harsh about a movie. So, the majority of the time, my opinions do change after a rewatch or two, which means I'm compelled to review it again in a post-sentencing hearing. If you listen this far into the podcast, then I salute you for sticking around to the second half of the Cinema Courtroom show. If you enjoy what you're hearing and what I have to say, if you haven't done so already, I would very much appreciate it if you just take a few seconds out of your time to give this podcast a reshare. Whether you're listening on Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, or the Cinema Courtroom YouTube channel, by clicking the likes button, it will not only alter the complex algorithm, but you'll also be supporting the Cinema Courtroom while you do it, as well as its future episodes, installments, and assets. That being said, I salute you in advance for your generous engagement and support, and I hope you continue to join us in the ride to success. In this hearing, we are going to cover the following: the possibility of Harrison Ford playing General Ross in the MCU, the anticipation level for Knives Out 2, and finally, to finish off this post-sentencing hearing, Christian Bale wanting to be in Star Wars, apparently. Enjoy. Do you remember that one guy who played the other guy who ran the Kessel Run in 12 parsecs? He also plays Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford. And it turns out that Harrison Ford is being considered to play MCU's General Ross, the asshole who mediated the Sokovia Accords in Captain America Civil War and unleashed the abomination in The Incredible Hulk. What a hypocrite. But I'm not here to talk about the character. I'm here to talk about who's going to be playing General Ross moving forward. And apparently, that might potentially be Harrison Ford. I'll tell you what. If you decide to fan cast someone like Harrison Ford, I'm all for doing that. Unless you forget to do one thing. Take into account the relationship between the studio and performer. And as long as we, take into account all of these facts, then I think Harrison Ford being recast as General Ross, yes, recast it, since unfortunately William Hurt, who had appeared in multiple Marvel projects, had passed away earlier this year. May he rest in peace. But anyway, Harrison Ford has a solid standing with Disney, the House of Mouse, because Harrison Ford plays characters in both Star Wars and Indiana Jones. Of course, they would want to cast him to play a significant role in another potentially significant movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe like Thunderbolts, where he's essentially going to be the main lead of Marvel's version of the Suicide Squad. On the other hand, and this is coming from a Screen Rant article, which is where we get most of our coverage from, Harrison Ford has yet to play a superhero. That being stated, if Harrison Ford were to be hypothetically cast in the MCU, we're going to have someone who isn't even acquainted with the superhero genre to begin with. Play someone who could potentially become Red Hulk, because turns out that Ross was Red Hulk in the comic books. So if Harrison Ford wants to play General Ross in the MCU, succeeding William Hurt, let me look at the calendar here. He needs to get started from today, Friday, October 14th, 2022, to July of 2024, which is when Thunderbolts will be releasing into cinemas worldwide, to do his homework and watch, heck, write a 5-page long essay on the superhero genre. Do you think if the rumors of Harrison Ford playing General Ross has any shred of credibility, that Mr. Ford is going to be able to play General Ross to a degree that is acceptable to connoisseurs of the comic book genre? Do you find this rumor of Harrison Ford playing General Ross to be absolute bogus? Because it may as well be. Does it have any nugget of credibility? I'd imagine that this could again just be something from a source that has been debunked countless times. Who knows? Whatever it is that you think about Harrison Ford potentially playing General Ross, let me know in the comment section below or our Twitter inbox at Cinema Courtroom. A while back, I watched a movie directed by Rian Johnson called Knives Out, and I for one think that it sets the precedent of how every murder mystery movie should strive to be in Hollywood. Unpredictable, but predictable enough to make sense to the story, because at the end of the day, you're constructing a narrative. So stick with that, and the rest will take care of itself. Delve into the context, culture, and suspense as the mystery unfolds throughout the movie, because that's how a murder mystery genre must always be. That's how you do it, and I think that Knives Out manages to do all of that and occupy all of these elements and much, much more. I might even be giving this movie too much credit, who knows, but I love that movie. It's something that I've rewatched countless times. That being said, the prospect of a Knives Out 2 is exciting for me, because we're actually going to see the talented Daniel Craig as Detective Blank again in Glass Onion and Knives Out Mystery this December, streaming only on Netflix. The question I want to answer now is this: is Knives Out 2 promising? We're going to dive into the promotional material for this new Knives Out movie, the directing ability of Rian Johnson, and the risks, if any, associated with producing a sequel to a beloved first installment, and whether or not that might slow down momentum for Knives Out 2 Glass Onion. Okay, so let's take a look at the existing promotional material for this movie. 3 weeks ago, we got to have a first glance at Glass Onion. Take a listen.
Ladies and gentlemen,
This is it.
you expected a mystery.
Get your hand off of that.
You expected a puzzle. But for one person on this island, this is not a game.
Will you explain it to us then, Detective? Duke?
Oh my God!
Really?
Lock the doors.
Stay in your rooms.
Everyone.
Is in danger.
Alright. Just in case you can't tell what's in the trailer, since I have converted it to MP3 in order to edit this podcast, and I would definitely recommend that you check out the Glass Onion trailer visually on MP4 to get a more concise picture of the upcoming movie. All you have to do is search Glass Onion and Knives Out teaser, and the trailer that you just heard will be the first thing that pops up. At the time of this recording, there hasn't really been another trailer for Knives Out. At Netflix To Doom event, they unveiled a clip from the movie, but it gave viewers more questions than answers of whether or not this movie is actually going to be good. It's good promotional material because it leaves us getting hyped for the movie because we want to know what happens, but we don't know whether or not it determines the final verdict. Is Knives Out 2 promising? Here's what I think based on this promotional material, and there are other factors which I'm going to get into, but we're going to talk about the promotional material first. Daniel Craig continues to kill it as a role of detective, even in the Glass Onion Knives Out trailer. I'm also a fan of Dave Bautista's acting performance. In fact, I spoke about him in length in this podcast's movie review, Army of the Dead. Suffice to say, Dave Bautista has a long way to go in his acting career to even be considered among a short list of legendary performers. But he's done a decent job, which can only mean that he is gradually transitioning from just being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as comedic relief to other films that demands more from Dave Bautista's acting abilities than ever before, especially in Glass Onion. What about Rian Johnson's directing ability, which is another factor? Here's what I have to say about that. Rian Johnson is definitely a competent director when given the correct guidance and a team of excellent writers, top of the line, and the inks of the writing pens perfect to the brim. Nothing more, nothing less. Other than that, Rian Johnson messed up big time with Star Wars The Last Jedi. Big time. I'm not even going to forgive him for that. I'm not going to lie and say that I'm chill every time I think about The Last Jedi. I'm not. I'm quite pissed. Rian Johnson messed up. I'm going to say it again. He did not do a good job when it came to handling a fan-beloved franchise. Now, obviously, Star Wars is not his expertise, but Rian Johnson wanted to direct anyway. Be that as it may, this segment isn't meant to diss Rian Johnson's one mistake in one movie, because he is a great director for Knives Out, and Rian Johnson's screenplay is one of the best murder mysteries that I've seen in a long way. It is engaging, unpredictable, while still making sense to the overarching narrative. It's safe to make the assumption that Knives Out 2 is in capable and supervised hands, and it might again be promising for as long as Rian Johnson gives Glass Onion his best and doesn't make it a gigantic flop, which would absolutely suck for his resume. Because I'd imagine if he had, half a mind when it came to Star Wars, he would distance himself from The Last Jedi. Like, leave it out of his portfolio. It stunk. Big time. But even though we have promotional material for Knives Out Glass Onion and Rian Johnson's 50-50 chance of directing a good screenplay like I just talked about, there might still be risks associated with making a sequel to a beloved first installment to begin with. In order to really grasp the point that I'm about to make, you must understand the demanding criteria as to what makes an exceptional sequel in general, which supersedes just Glass Onion. This can be applied to any sequel. According to the Writer's Digest, making a sequel doesn't mean you just pick up where the last story left off. You must do something fresh and different. You can't flat out copy the first movie, especially since Knives Out belongs to the mystery genre. Keyword, mystery. And using it as a template will squash that mystery and suspense. At the same time, you have to retain some things consistent to the vibe of Knives Out. You have to hold fast to most elements from the first Knives Out movie when it comes to the tone and the impact of whatever is being revealed in the third act, or maybe second act, but the third act is dealing with repercussions, whatever. It is very possible that Knives Out might drop a ball in its sequel since it can't keep up with difficult requirements. With all of that down, I think Knives Out 2 is a promising sequel. Do I have doubts that it's gonna win the jackpot twice? Sure I do. Might these doubts vanish as I finally get to watch the movie? Likely so. Or at least, I hope so. How about you? Yes, you, my awesome listeners tuning into this awesome podcast. Do you think that Glass Onion and Knives Out Mystery will be a promising sequel? Do you think that it isn't promising? Whatever it is that you think, let me know in the comment section below or our Twitter inbox at Cinema Courtroom.
Hello there.
There's a saying that goes, you either die as playing Batman in the Dark Knight trilogy, or you live long enough to see yourself play a character in Star Wars. That's right, ladies and gents. Christian Bale wants to be in Star Wars. I'm gonna read what he said to the Hollywood Reporter, and I quote, "All I ever wanted in Star Wars was to be in a Star Wars outfit and hit my head on a door or something as I walked through. The real nerds who watched Star Wars way too many times always knew about that one scene where the stormtrooper hit his head on the door as he comes through. I wanted to be that guy. That was it. But look, if I'm fortunate enough to be more than that, oh man, yeah, what a delight that would be. I've still got the figures from when I was little. I also know Kathy Kennedy very well because she was working with Spielberg when I did Empire of the Sun, and now she runs the Star Wars universe." What is it with people casting others who are specialized into one movie genre into another? I mean, we are already dealing with that with, the rumors of Harrison Ford being opted in to play General Ross. I digress to say that it turns out, and I got this from the direct, Christian Bale has one Star Wars role that he wants to consider. Alright, now that's very interesting because to start with, both Star Wars, Marvel, and even DC loved to cast big names who had appeared in other big projects because those names often sell. Why else do you think Christian Bale got casted for the MCU's latest release for Love and Thunder? Well, the answer to that is not rocket science when you read or hear Christian Bale himself. You see one of the most iconic Caped Crusaders of the comic book genre, Batman. It would be absolute corporate suicide not to cast him in another popular trilogy or franchise. Christian Bale has now not only played an iconic DC character, Christian Bale has also played a respectable Marvel villain in Thor: Love and Thunder. Why not throw Star Wars into the lovely mix? And I know it isn't up to me, but how cool would it be for Christian Bale to play an anti-hero in Star Wars? Because there are three kinds of characters in a standard narrative: the hero, protagonist, villain, and anti-hero. Christian Bale has played the first two, but he has yet to play an anti-hero, especially in a critically acclaimed IP like Star Wars. Furthermore, Christian Bale's eagerness to land a Star Wars project will be accepted by me on one condition. And by the way, I know that Christian Bale doesn't give two shits about my opinion, but I'll say it here anyway. So, have Christian Bale play an anti-hero in Star Wars. I don't care what the story for the Star Wars project is. I don't care how childish I just was a few seconds ago. It still has to be good and proficient, obviously, because We don't want a repeat of Thor: Love and Thunder, right? Because whilst Thor: Love and Thunder was acceptable, that was only because of Christian Bale. But other than that, the humor dragged on a bit, in my opinion, and the majority of the critics' opinion. But it would be befitting to have an actor who has played a protagonist and antagonist play something in between. That, and it will be a colossal coincidence that I think most of the audience is going to enjoy and want more of. But in the off chance that you belong to the minority of the audience who isn't the big fan of the prospect of Christian Bale being in Star Wars, whether it be because of Love and Thunder, PTSD, or whatever completely valid concerns you might have in your possession, I would be very intrigued to know about all of them. The good, the bad, the ugly, in the comment section below or our Twitter inbox at the Cinema Courtroom. We have now reached the end of this podcast. Thank you for tuning in to the Cinema Courtroom show, where we critiqued movies. I had a lot of fun doing this podcast, so be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed episode 16 of the Cinema Courtroom, just as I do every week making them. I hope to see you guys again in the next episode, where we're going to talk about, yet again, another movie. As for what movie it's going to be, find out when the next and 17th episode of the Cinema Courtroom show launches this coming Tuesday on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and the Amazon Music platform. Thank you once again for listening till the end. I'm your Galactic Judge, Mark, and I extend you a very spectacular day.
Hello there.
Court is now dismissed.